Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C., and this is our July 24th legislative update. We're calling this week's edition Priorities Advancing because we have actual progress on a number of legislative initiatives that IEEE-USA has been championing here in Washington, and we will get right into those. Start with a quick little political update, as we mentioned last time. Oh, before I forget, if you have questions, comments, things you would like a response to, please put them in the chat function on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll try to rotate to some of those at the end of the presentation, and otherwise I'll get back to them later on this afternoon. So our political calendar this year is dominated by the elections, not surprisingly. Just over a month, both of the conventions will have been completed, and then we will be in the hardcore presidential campaign season, although nobody has any idea what that's actually going to look like. The Democratic convention is August 17th through 20th in Milwaukee. Republican convention is August 24th through 27, now in Charlotte, North Carolina. Both of the conventions are scheduled to be smaller, quieter, and shorter than they were originally intended to be. The grand, huge spectacle that we have come to expect of these conventions has been dramatically pared back to a relatively small business meeting, followed by an acceptance speech with a little bit of pomp, but not all that much. Like I said, this election is going to be unlike any we've had. With candidates who can't actually talk to people. I'm not sure how one campaigns, not just at the presidential level, but the governors and senators and congressmen and city council and mayors and everybody else who's running this November. But I suspect the country will manage, and they'll find a way to get their message through. We're finally starting to see some movement on the next COVID relief bill. Now, you remember I mentioned last time, Congress is facing a deadline. The supplemental unemployment insurance, the extra $600 that was created back in March, runs out at the end of July, so the end of next week. That gives Congress essentially one more week to do whatever they're going to do to follow up on the CARES Act. We have no idea what that's going to be. The House passed a $3.4 trillion COVID relief bill back in May. That is not going to be the bill. I don't think we can have a bill quite that big. That'd be 3.4 trillion borrowed dollars on top of the 1.2 trillion that we borrowed for the CARES Act, on top of the 1 trillion that we were already running in deficit for, plus the little less than $1 trillion we'd spent on other COVID relief activities, which adds up to an awful lot of money. But it's a negotiating point, and that's fine as an opening bid. We do not yet have a draft from the Senate. Senate Republicans and the administration, the Trump administration, are negotiating a lot of different pieces of what this package is going to be. Some of the things they're debating at the moment is, first of all, what to do about the $600 in unemployment benefits. I don't think that's going to be what they end up with, simply renewing what's already there, although that is easy and quick. So if they start to run out of time, that's an easy fallback. They're talking about another check. We had the $1,500 to every American several months ago. They probably wouldn't do one quite that big, but some direct economic stimulus to every American. There was talk of doing something with the payroll tax, but that didn't go very far. And possibly even some sort of incentive to get people back to work. This may also include some sort of additional money for the PPP program, which supports small businesses. Very popular program. It's out of money. But there are proposals floating around to dump a bunch of new money into the program. The Republicans are talking about $100 billion in new money to help K-12 schools deal with the COVID crisis. And this particular proposal highlights a problem that Congress has with this entire package. Schools are right now buying technology, hiring staff, buying software, training people on how to do distance learning. and buying new cleaning supplies and putting new procedure, all of which costs money. So they are currently spending extra money to deal with COVID. Congress is proposing $100 billion. Now that's a lot of money. But when you divide that by the roughly 130,000 public schools in this country, again, K through 12, that's about $770,000 per school, which for some schools is a lot, and for other schools it really isn't. So the question then immediately is, how do we distribute this money in a way that is equitable and a way that helps, go where we definitely most need it? And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can do it, we're going to prioritize places that have been hit hard by COVID. We're going to prioritize places that are currently being hit hard by COVID. We're going to prioritize places where students don't have access to particularly good internet, places where the parents of students are more likely to work, and therefore the students won't have a good home situation where they can go to school without actually going to school. So there's a lot of different criteria you can set up. The problem is we don't have time for any of that. In a normal time, when Congress wanted to create a program, $100 billion to help our schools, it would be 9 to 12 months before the money actually started to go from the federal government and start to show up in the accounts of the various schools. You got to create some regulations. You need to create a criteria, which gets approved by the public. You have to put things in place. You got to get up. There's a lot of things you got to do to distribute this volume of money. But Congress wants to distribute it right now, and certainly by the end of August. And what that means is they can't have a particularly complicated formula for deciding who gets the money, which means many of the policy options that they normally would have are off the table. So, for example, they could say, okay, you're going to get, I'm making this number up, $10 in federal support for every student you had in your school on September 15th, 2019. There you go. Now, it's just based on the size of the school. We'll have no other criteria. That's a number the schools already have, so they should be able to produce it fairly quickly. And the math is pretty straightforward. But anything more elaborate than something very basic like that, you can't do. And the result of that will be these programs designed to help kind of the entire society are not going to be as efficiently distributed as they could have been. But there's a trade-off. Do you want it fast or do you want it right? Well, in this case, I think we want it fast, which means the distribution won't be perfect. As $20 billion is a number that's being tossed around to help out farmers, ranchers, and other food producers. There's also talk of a program to help food consumers, that is Americans that have food insecurity, to make sure supplemental money for food assistance programs has mostly been spent. And so there's a movement to re-up those. And most importantly to us, the Senate is talking about $5.5 billion for research. Important to point out that's not for new research. When society shut down back in March, almost every federal research program was also shut down. The act of shutting down your program, the act of starting it back up again, both cost money in many cases. And as labs bring people back to work, additional safety precautions, additional cleaning supplies, additional facility space in some cases, all cost money. So this $15.5 billion is not for new research. It's to offset the costs associated with doing research in a COVID environment. There are other proposals, which we'll talk about in a minute, for additional research funding. But this particular proposal is just to deal with the COVID problem. There's also talk of a bailout for universities in general. It hasn't gotten as much traction as I thought it would. I suspect at some point universities will make a stronger pitch for some additional money. But at the moment, a straight bailout of universities does not appear to be on the table, although that can change. So the timing of all this is that I expect the Senate will produce something very early next week, Monday, Tuesday morning at the absolute latest. There will be much yelling and screaming and hemming and hawing on the part of all the various legislators, and that the Democrats, Republicans, House, Senate, administration will all reach an agreement on some sort of rather large bill by the end of next week, maybe over the weekend. Technically, their deadline is Friday, but if they miss it by a day or two, it's not that big a deal. At which point Congress will go out of session for August, as they always do. And that's the end of the legislating until probably the fall. Which brings us to appropriations. We're starting to see appropriations bills. They've been trickling out over the last few weeks. All of the appropriations bills have been introduced, at least in the House. None of them have been introduced in the Senate. Now, you'll remember, Constitution says the House has to go first on appropriations bills. So it is usual for the Senate to be behind schedule, though not usually this far behind schedule. Pardon me. The House has created two what are called mini buses. These are mini omnibus bills. An omnibus bill is when you take all the appropriations bills and jam them into one gigantic budget bill. They're not doing that. They've created two little omnibus bills that have a few of the budget bills in them, and they're passing those independently. A little easier to get your head around, which is all very interesting, but also probably irrelevant. Congress is really far behind on all of this. Even with the action that we've seen over the last couple of weeks in the House, the bills that they're producing are not really anywhere near a final draft, which is fine. I mean, the House does their thing, the Senate does their thing, and then the real work begins. But the Senate isn't really doing its work. The two parties are way apart in what the budget priorities are. Time is extremely short. So we are now almost certainly to get one big omnibus bill passed after the election, so in late November, probably mid-December, or simply a continuing resolution saying everybody keep spending what you're spending until some point in the future. And that's what I actually expect will happen. Which means why I'm not reporting on what the appropriations numbers are, because it doesn't matter what the House is saying because they're not going to be the final numbers. I will say that we did get some fairly good budget increases in last year's budget. So a continuing resolution is not so bad for us because we were happy with most of our budgets at the end of last year. And if we get them again in 2021 with a little increase for inflation, that's still pretty good. Now for the exciting part. Last several weeks, we've been talking about the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. It is a bill that has to pass this year, that will pass this year. And thus, everybody and their cousin are trying to get every possible legislative thing attached to it. Because if you can get your thing in the NDAA, it's probably going to become law. We have, IEEE-USA has successfully gotten at least 3 amendments added to the NDAA so far. That will benefit IEEE members, and we think is good policy. Eddie Bernice Johnson, Congresswoman Johnson, added the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative to the House version. The Senate is also favorably inclined towards that amendment. The Cornyn Amendment was the CHIPS Act. That's the bill to promote computer chip manufacturing in the United States. That was one of only 6 amendments added in the Senate. By the way, interesting contrast between the two chambers. So there's an issue about germaneness on a bill like this. Germaneness says, if you have a bill like the NDAA that is about national defense and about the Defense Department, you should only attach amendments to it that pertain to the Defense Department. Otherwise, it's not germane. So we shouldn't be doing immigration policy or education policy in a defense-related bill. The Senate took that fairly seriously, and the Senate ruled out of order almost all of the amendments proposed by senators to the NDAA. Senator Cornyn's, like I said, was one of 6 that was accepted. The House, on the other hand, accepted almost every amendment, and they had something like 400 amendments that they went through over just a couple days to the NDAA, most of which were ultimately accepted. So that brings us to the Endless Frontier Act. Now, you recall this is Senator Schumer's baby. It's a bipartisan bill, so he has support from both parties. Senator Schumer and Young introduced it in the Senate, but Senator Schumer's the champion. I mean, he's number 2 Democrat in the Senate, so that's, pretty good. The Endless Frontier Act amendment proposed by Senator Schumer was ruled out of order in the Senate. It was not germane. But Congressman Khanna, representing Silicon Valley, introduced placeholder language in the House. It's a relatively simple amendment that says basically it is the sense of Congress that provisions like the Endless Frontiers Act should be enacted. Now, if you just read the text of his amendment, it doesn't say anything. It's like, Okay, this is the sense of the Congress. That doesn't mean anything. But what Khanna did is he added the Endless Frontier Act to the House version of the bill, even if just by reference. The House has its version of NDAA. The Senate has its version of NDAA. They are not the same. Once both chambers pass their version, they'd have to go to what's called a conference committee, where leaders of both parties in both chambers get together in a meeting room somewhere in the Capitol, close the door, and figure out all the details of the bill, come out of the room with one final version of, in this case, the NDAA, which goes back to the House and Senate for another vote. That vote, there can be no amendments. The chambers just vote them up or down. The rule is that within the conference committee, legislators can only raise issues that were part of either the House or the Senate bill. In other words, the conferees cannot bring in issues that aren't in one of the bills and say, you know what, I think we should do something on spending money on national parks. Well, it's not in either House or Senate bill, so you're not supposed to bring it up. It happens. They do it on occasion, but they're not supposed to. When Congressman Khanna added language referencing the Endless Frontier Act to the House version of the bill, he was empowering Senator Schumer to fight for the Endless Frontier Act in conference committee. So while Congressman Khanna's amendment didn't do very much, it allows Senator Schumer to do quite a bit, and fingers crossed, to bring in the full Endless Frontier Act into the conference version of the NDAA, which ultimately is the one that will pass. So while we didn't get the amendment we were hoping for in the Senate, we got something that may in the end up being good enough. So overall, we're fairly pleased with this. We got 3 good amendments added to the NDAA that will do good things for IEEE and our members, and so we're pretty pleased with that outcome. Another little aside to the NDAA debate. There was a back and forth dialogue, to put it politely, between Senator Durbin and Senator Lee. Senator Lee proposed his Fairness Act as an amendment to the NDAA. Fairness Act, you may recall, eliminates the country caps from the EB visa program. IEEE-USA supports removing the country caps. However, if that's all you do, and that is all the Fairness Act does, you end up hurting a huge number of people. Basically, people that are currently in line for a green card and should be receiving the green card in the next couple of years have to move to the back of the line, as people who have been waiting, in some case, a decade or more for a green card move to the front of the line. Now, getting the folks who are waiting for a green card through the line quickly is a priority of ours, and it's something we've been fighting for years, but would rather not do it at the expense of everybody else that's waiting in line. So Senator Lee introduced his bill. Senator Durbin blocked it. In order to move the Fairness Act amendment, Senator Lee needed unanimous consent. Senator Durbin said no. But Senator Durbin said something else. He said, we want to work out a compromise with Senator Lee on this bill. In particular, there were a couple provisions that Senator Durbin highlighted. One is a hold harmless provision. Like I said, if all you do is get rid of the country caps, everybody that's been waiting in line for an EB visa for a very long time moves to the front. Everybody who is about to get their visa and was getting their visa very quickly moves to the back. Senator Durbin's proposal is to say nobody gets hurt when we get rid of the country caps. So we will allow everybody in line to keep their place in line, keep their entry date. That's the date when a visa would become available, even if the line is reshuffled. Senator Lee had originally agreed to that, but changed his mind. The administration opposed it. So that was one issue. Second issue is the 50-50 rule. The 50-50 rule says, and this is one of the things that we get excited about, that companies can only have 50% of their employees on an H-1B visa if they have more than 50 employees. Now, the consequence of that provision would be to make it very difficult for outsourcing companies to continue to function. These are companies whose almost their entire American workforce are H-1B workers because they try not to hire Americans. And just to fill out the story, The H-1B workers these outsourcing companies employ are almost never invited to become Americans. Company has to sponsor you for the green card. If they decline to do it, you're just out of luck. So the 50% rule says if a company has, 5 or 6, 10 or 20 in some cases, H-1B workers, that's fine. But if 90% of their workforce are H-1B, that's probably a problem. Now, Senator Lee had agreed to the 50%, the 50-50 rule back in December. The administration and then ultimately Senator Lee asked Senator Durbin if they could postpone the 50% rule for 3 years. Their logic was it would take companies 3 years to adjust to this new rule. Senator Durbin did not accept that compromise on the logic that the companies we're talking about are outsourcers. In other words, the business model that they're going to have a hard time accommodating is a business model they shouldn't be doing in the first place. And therefore, letting them continue to do something they're not supposed to be doing anyway, just to be clear, it's legal, but it's against the spirit of the law and something we wish they wouldn't do. So rather than let them do something they shouldn't be doing anyway for 3 years, they said, nope, we want to have it immediately, and we see no reason not to. IEEE-USA supports Senator Durbin in this fight, and we appreciate him standing up, both for green card holders and for H-1B workers who are put in a position where they can be easily exploited by their outsourcing bosses. Quick little update on student visas. You will recall 2 weeks ago we talked about a USCIS rule that would prohibit international students taking all of their classes online from getting a student visa. IEEE-USA put out a statement opposing that restriction, and shortly thereafter the rule was withdrawn. I don't think our position statement, our public statement rather, is the cause of the administration withdrawing that rule, but we were still glad that they did it all the same. And that is our quick update for this week. Our next update will be already in August 7th at 1 p.m. By then, Congress should be into its August recess. We should know what the next COVID bill looks like, and we should start seeing some movements in the presidential and other races that we can talk about as well. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA. If you have questions about anything you heard here today, please put them in your chat, and Jonathan, my colleague, will relay them to me. Otherwise, my email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. My direct line is 202-530-8326. Jonathan, did we have any questions today? I'm going to take that as a no. And with that, and like I said, if you have questions, come up with them in an hour or so, please put them into the chat function on your computer, and I'll get back to them later today or over the weekend. Or you can just email me directly or call me directly if you want to chat. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a great weekend. Stay cool, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you.